Thank you very much. So a couple of things just before I start. One is, as Stefan mentioned, I was CTO for Honeywell Specialty Products, and one of the things that we did when I was with that organization was additives for asphalt. So I was pretty interested to hear, John, your additives. So maybe we should talk at some point about that. The other thing is, prior to that, I spent 3 years in India starting up an R&D organization. And why that's relevant is because I considered myself, even though I was director of the organization, I considered myself chief cultural officer. Because my job was basically to create an organization. When I went to India, I had 1 employee. When I left, there was about 100 or so. And as you'll hear in my talk, and by the way, I understand I'm the only thing between you and lunch, so I'll try to be brief. We have a very strong culture within our organization. We value innovation, scientific curiosity. It's the lifeblood that makes our organization work. We had made a decision a number of years ago to build an organization in India to support that. And so my role there was to do many of the things that we just heard about, which was really to try to inject a sense of curiosity and love of learning and innovation in that organization. So that was a tremendous amount of fun. I need to find the clicker. So just before I start, let me just give you a brief background. Many of you know Honeywell. You may not know all of the parts of Honeywell. It's about a $40 billion business. The biggest piece of that is the aerospace business. The part of the business that UOP sits in is within the Performance Materials and Technologies business, a little bit less than $10 billion in total. So what does UOP do? This is relevant to the talk. This is just not self-adulation. So UOP was started in 1914. With an inventor who discovered a way to take crude oil that was coming out of the ground in California as an emulsion. And he figured out that if you put it through a furnace along with steam, you actually could crack that oil and break the emulsion and generate a larger proportion of motor spirit, which was then in tremendous demand right at the time when the motor car was becoming popular, and there was a shortage of motor spirit to drive those vehicles. So that was how UOP got its technology. It spent the first 20 years of its life suing all of the other people who had stolen the invention that they were able to patent, and they discovered that it was a pretty interesting business model. Which was, let's do some invention, get patents, and then go around and sue people. And then over a period of time, that turned into a little bit more disciplined business of licensing technology. So essentially, we're a process licensing organization. In total in the company, about 2,500 engineers and scientists, about 800 people in the R&D organization, many of them chemists and chemical engineers primarily, and about 3,000 patents actively at the moment. So across the top you see the 4 major pillars, if you like, of the business. It started in the refining space. Over time, particularly starting in the 1960s and the 1970s, became more involved in the petrochemicals area. Natural gas more recently, with tremendous growth that's happened in the natural gas space, and then most recently in renewables, particularly renewable fuel materials. So what I want to do today is talk about the research and development organization a little bit, and specifically what I want to do is talk about kind of a case study. And it seems to me it logically flows a little bit from what we just heard from John's talk and some of the other things that we heard earlier today as well. So we have quite a number of employees that have patents, 400 or so of our employees have at least one patent. A dozen or so more than 50. I think there's half a dozen that are more than 100. So a pretty successful patenting organization. Well-established infrastructure for innovating in the spaces in which we occupy. So we've got, I would say, probably world-class capabilities to be able to do research supporting catalysis, process development, materials discovery, materials characterization, and so on, which are the things that you need to be able to do to be successful in this space. And I would say we have a pretty unique set of capabilities along the tier on the right-hand side. And on top of that, I would say a very focused mindset around innovation and discovery. So by all intents and purposes, and there's lots of ways to measure innovation, and in many respects, patents is a terrible way to measure innovation. But for us, it's important because we are a licensing business. So essentially, while our revenues don't all come from licensed products because we sell a lot of catalyst materials, adsorbents, and so on, it's a reasonable measure of innovation. And overall, for an organization our size, you'd say that's pretty good. So overall, pretty successful. The other measure of success of R&D is people talk in terms of R&D vitality, and in our case, we measure it by products that are less than 5 years old. So somewhere in the realm of 30% or so of our products are less than 5 years old. So that good? It depends on the business, but the key point is really that it's largely focused on those segments that I showed in the previous slide. Refining, petrochemicals, natural gas, renewables a little bit less so. So the challenge for us was how to refocus the organization into new growth areas beyond the areas in which we had been eminently successful for a long period of time. So let me step away just for a second and talk a little bit about some of the macro trends that are influencing the industries that we participate in. So things like electrification of transportation. We've already heard about lithium batteries today. Autonomous shared vehicles. A practical issue for refining companies is diminishing returns on oil refining for fuels, and a global switch for refining companies to making petrochemicals because they are higher margin products. Environmental constraints, something that everybody I think is extremely familiar with, and we heard also earlier about energy efficiency as a key driver that really ties in very closely, I think, with environmental constraints. Availability of clean water, digitization, and what I describe as the Internet of Everything, because essentially everything is becoming connected these days. Polymer recycling, we have the world's largest technology to produce paraxylene, which ultimately is the feedstock for polyester that goes into a great many different products. What opportunities are there for polymer recycling, for taking polyester and recycling it back to its initial components, for example? And so on. I'm not going to read the whole list here. You can see what's there. These are all macro trends that everybody is familiar with, that every magazine that you pick up on any given day will have reference to at least some, if not many of these. So for us, the trends indicate that there are obviously, on the one hand, potential growth vectors that we should be considering besides the ones that we're participating in at the moment. But also, there are trends that potentially have an adverse effect on the kinds of business that we participate in. So to the extent, for example, that electric vehicles, as Tony Seba likes to say, will essentially be the only form of transportation within 20 years. That has a tremendous potential impact on the world's refiners. Because if that actually is true, and oh, by the way, I don't believe it's entirely true, although I think it's certainly partially true, the question then becomes, what implication does that have for the rest of the world? Potentially enormous. But for us as a licensor in the refining business, a pretty significant impact on us. So we better start thinking about doing something different. So this is just an example portfolio, and this is a couple of bar charts, and I just wanted to illustrate a point here. Anybody who's ever done portfolio management for a business will recognize this version of the chart. So essentially, on the left-hand side, you've got every single bar corresponds to a product development project that we have. And when we say product development, it could be a product, it could be process, it could be software, it could be anything. So the size of the bar is the project NPV. So we don't include long-range R&D things in this that don't necessarily have a solid business case. But whenever you plot these up in rank order, you always get a chart that looks like this. And essentially, what we have here is, okay, we set a waterline at some point, and you ask yourself the question, well, why on earth didn't you take these? Because these are worth a lot more than most of these here. Well, there's always reasons why you pick projects that are less value, they are strategic, whatever. But what it says is there's a relatively long project tail in there of, I guess I would say, questionable value. And likewise, this chart is the same chart, but now the same thing, but now divided by the cost to complete the project. And in some respects, it looks even worse. The only problem is these projects don't correspond to these projects over here. Frequently, they correspond to projects up here. So that's the challenge of portfolio management, is trying to pick the ones that are valuable. But the point of this is, in any portfolio that you have of your R&D programs, there's always an opportunity to pick ones that are relatively low value and say, okay, maybe I should redeploy those onto something else. I want to talk a little bit about people, since we were talking about culture before. So let me just talk a little bit about our organization. First of all, we have a centralized R&D organization in the sense that it's not rigidly aligned with individual businesses, but we do have very strong linkages between R&D and the businesses. We have quite a number of younger scientists that have been hired in recent years who are looking to advance their careers, as everyone does, in an organization that has a population of senior staff. Most of the senior staff have become successful as a result of supporting the core businesses that we operate in. Many of the projects that we work on are highly constrained in that the businesses have said, I want 1% more yield, I want 2% lower cost, I want, tightly bounded problems, right? That limit the opportunity for scientists to really have the flexibility that perhaps they'd like to have, and certainly limit their opportunity for innovation. The other observation is that people like to work on challenging problems, and they also like recognition for what they work on. Solving business problems provides fairly quick gratification. So you have a dilemma, because on the one hand, you've got a constrained set of problems, but I know I can work on this pretty quickly, I can get come to a solution relatively fast, and I can get a pat on the back if I'm successful. It can be hard for a scientist or an engineer to make a name for herself or himself in an entirely new space. Businesses are skeptical or not interested. It's difficult to build a resume of substantial accomplishments. And then finally, in order to operate in new spaces, you need to be flexible and comfortable with a high level of uncertainty. You need to operate in a VUCA world, I guess is the way to describe it. So not everybody is suited to the ambiguity. So the question for us was, how do we redirect the innovation focus for the organization into some new areas? So the approach that we took, and this is a very you would say this is kind of a simplistic example, but we actually found it to be quite useful. So basically, we took a strategic scenarios approach. We identified a number of promising growth areas based on the competencies that we have in the organization. And we wanted to engage younger scientists to give them opportunity to showcase their capabilities. So the scenarios, to develop those, we took a group of R&D leaders and identified the scenarios. Our CTO selected the final 5 scenarios that we were going to explore. Then we invited the whole organization to vote on which ones they would like to engage with. So this was kind of in a sense, sort of an internal crowdsourcing activity, if you want to think about it that way. Not a very sophisticated process, but it was pretty interesting. And then from that, we selected teams of 6 or 8 people, primarily younger scientists, to work these scenarios. And then those teams engaged with the larger organization through some online activities. And then we gave the teams about 3 months to work the issue, come back with proposals, and then we gave them another month to, after we gave the initial feedback session, to do the final project wrap-up. So what did we tell the teams to do? We said, imagine a world in the future where the scenario is true. Science fiction, right? Doesn't exist today. Imagine a world where it is in the future. Think about what the enablers are for that scenario to occur. What has to be invented, what new technology has to come about, what regulations are a key part of our lives, right? So what regulatory environment has to occur? What can our organization do to influence the future? And does the future have negative consequences? I already talked about the electric vehicle scenario. Potentially that scenario has a negative impact on us. What do we do about that in the event that that scenario comes to pass? And I cite the electric vehicle one here. In the interest of time, let me skip over that. So what are the scenarios that we picked? As I said, we picked 5. And they are listed here. So green polymers displace conventional polymers. We already heard a little bit about some of that this morning. New fuels required for engine technologies, and we took the term new fuels to be very expansive. So new fuels could be battery technology. It could be, people are still talking about hydrogen as a vehicle fuel, although I'm not sure how realistic that really is. Methanol fuel cells, another example. Clean water availability fully meets global demand. Obviously, that's a UN goal. Environmental constraints is something that everyone is concerned about in the chemical industry. And then finally, flexible processes for cost-effective refining and petrochemicals. One of the things that our customers are telling us is we would like to have the ability to both make fuels and petrochemicals and also have the flexibility to be able to perhaps switch between those. So those are the scenarios that we picked, and across the top is just kind of a little bit of a map of how we got to those, starting with the mega trends, assessing those mega trend impacts on us, and then filtering the scenarios. So relatively straightforward process. I'm not going to go into discussing what the output of the teams is, because that's really largely translated into some new R&D programs for us that we're still trying to digest internally. But what I wanted to share with this audience a little bit is about what we learned going through the process. First of all, we've identified a couple of initiatives which have pretty high potential value, and we actually have initiated R&D programs in both of them. The scenario thought process, I think, is a great way to energize the R&D organization. And we talked a little bit earlier about engagement of people, and this was conceived not only as a growth exercise, but it was also conceived as an engagement exercise, because we felt like many of the younger people in the organization were not as engaged as we would like in where we wanted to go. Engage them in technology strategy, gets them to think beyond the scope of what they tend to come in and do on a day-to-day basis. Forces a little bit of business thinking, because in the end analysis, this is really a business analysis kind of exercise. Imagine a future world. Why would we want to do that? How could we make money if we did that? And it was an opportunity for high potential young scientists to develop and shine in situations where they otherwise might not. So the teams generated a pretty wide range of ideas, ranging from very short-term kind of stuff to some truly visionary long-term things. The thing that surprised us was it was more difficult than we expected to stretch the organization's what I call imagination muscles. They're very much constrained by what is. And I guess this going back to what I was saying at the outset, this is kind of the symptom of a successful organization, right? Everybody knows how to model what it is to be successful. So it becomes very difficult when you ask people to do something completely different from what they do on a day-to-day basis. So they need permission to imagine what might be. So we're definitely going to do this again. We'll do a deeper dive in some areas. Some of them we felt like we didn't get quite as much as we would have liked out of them. We'll add some new scenarios to the mix. And you know, clearly this was an R&D focused activity. So it was not a company strategic activity where the strategic marketing folks or the company leadership were driving the direction of this. This is very much internally R&D driven. So this is really only going to be an adjunct to the larger growth initiatives that exist within the organization. But to my mind, a very valuable one. And we've got some tremendous feedback from the people who participated in this, felt like this was a great growth opportunity for them. Thanks very much.